For those of you who weren't here yesterday or don't know me, I'm Todd Katzner. I am the local representative on the scientific committee for the conference. So as a reminder, when the scientific committee and the Carolina Raptor Center were planning the plenaries, we didn't want to simply put forth some really experienced people to talk about random stuff. We wanted to tell stories that were locally relevant and that highlighted raptor conservation, the Southeast environment, and the mission of our conference host. And so yesterday we had a talk about an iconic species in Eastern North America, including the North Carolina Highlands. We were focused on golden eagles. Tomorrow we're going to have a talk on avian influenza and raptors, which is kind of a big deal. And today we're going to talk about black vultures, which are one of the biggest raptor management issues in the Southeast. And so today's talk is entitled Conserving, Managing, and Researching and Expanding Species, the Black Vulture. Our speaker is Bryan Kluever. I want to give you a brief introduction to Bryan. Time is up. Thanks, Rob. Rob's just upset because he started late. Now we're going late. Anyway, Dr. Bryan Kluever is a supervisory research wildlife biologist within the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Wildlife Services and the National Wildlife Research Center, NWRC. He's a wildlife ecologist interested in determining how behavioral processes such as foraging, movement, habitat selection, and competition scale up to affect the demography and community dynamics of terrestrial vertebrates, especially those species with a human-wildlife conflict nexus. As the NWRC Florida Field Station leader, he leads a team of natural resource professionals who employ observational, experimental, and captive animal wildlife research to come up with robust, common sense solutions to human-wildlife conflict issues. So for those of you who aren't sure, this is not a black vulture. I just wanted to make that clear, but despite that, black vultures are rapidly expanding in range and number. And for those of you who know the story, it's a really interesting concept. In a world where so many of our raptors are declining, the two most common North American vultures are a cool story. And because of this, black vultures, because of their expansion, they've become a massive conservation issue throughout their North American range, largely because there's so many of them. And managers need information to take actions to address the issues caused by this population growth. Bryan is really the leading light providing a lot of this information. His work is geared towards addressing the knowledge gaps in key areas of importance to biologists throughout black vultures range. And appropriately, black vultures are obviously a huge conservation issue in this region, and they're central to the experience of the Carolina Raptor Center. They interact with lots of black vultures. If you've been around here for a few days, you've probably seen them foraging on roadkill by the side of the road, and that means they interact with vehicles, sometimes in ways that are not particularly healthy for the vulture. So anyway, Dr. Kluever is the perfect person to really talk to these issues at this conference. And so I'm thrilled to introduce him to all of you. So Bryan, why don't you step up and is this one your presentation?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So hopefully we can, there we go. Okay, take it away.
I thought I was going to be breaking out into song and dance as we were doing this from the music, but I've been rescued from that. And more importantly, you've been rescued from me trying to dance. So thank you for taking time to hear me talk about black vultures. As was alluded to, I'm a little bit new to the raptor research game. I've been working on this species for about 5 years. There's certainly some people in this room that I have no doubt have as much, if not more, knowledge than I do, and I hope to talk to you guys some about Black Vultures when I'm done blabbering. So I do want to talk about the agency that I work for just really briefly, because we're not the most maybe well-known agency, and we're smaller than some of the other agencies that work on wildlife. So I work for a small research division of wildlife services called the National Wildlife Research Center. I've listed some of our project areas there on the left. This slide is kind of busy, but the main thing to realize is most of our scientists are based out of Fort Collins, Colorado. We do have 6 field stations throughout the United States, including one in Hawaii, kind of a 7th field station in Guam now that exclusively does work on brown tree snakes and trying to bring back some of the birds that have gone extinct there, and they're actually having some success, but that's a whole another topic. I work in Gainesville, Florida. For whatever reason, we don't actually know how it happened. One of our field stations is there, and if you guys are ever in northern Florida, please look us up and we'll be happy to give you a tour of the place. We have some large aviaries and flight pen. In fact, my mom calls our back 20 acres Jurassic Park because she thinks she's going to see a Tyrannosaurus Rex come out of the aviary or something. So, just a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I like to give a global perspective to vultures, of course, because the species I'm going to be talking about, unfortunately, most vulture species are not in a similar situation. I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent conflict-driven research that we've done using existing data, including from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm going to, again, talk about management tools a little bit. One of the things that I'm tasked with is trying to validate and test methods, specifically non-lethal methods for black vultures. So I'm going to just go over one contemporary study in that arena. The area that I think is probably most in need of more research is the black vulture livestock conflict, and so I'm going to talk on that a little bit specifically, and that's one that probably invokes the most passion in folks in both on all sides of the spectrum, so I think it's important to talk about that. And then research needs, I'm actually hoping some of you guys will come up to me today and let me know what you guys think myself and others should be working on for black vultures, because there's definitely more that we can be doing. So again, going to just give a global perspective really quick. So the species I'm here to talk to you about today actually is, I believe, the smallest vulture in terms of wingspan, but not in weight. They're stocky little buggers. And again, they're doing quite well, as I'm going to show, but the other side of this story is most vultures are not doing well. So these are the endangered or critically imperiled vulture species that we have throughout the globe. I've talked to the folks that make this graph, and it sounds like they might be actually adding some of these other species to that list of ones that are in pretty big trouble. So I think most of us in this room know why vultures are important. We'll just go over a little bit really quick. So they can basically act as the garbage disposals. I know that this is not a black vulture, but this is a turkey vulture that is that's often used at outreach events, and that's something that I think we can definitely do a better job of getting some of these vultures on the glove and getting them out and letting people know the great things that vultures do. This Hill et al. 2002 study showed that over 50% of diet items from both black and turkey vultures are anthropogenic in nature, or at least have an anthropogenic item in their pellets. And so that's not including roadkill. That's an anthropogenic, or that's basically food waste, garbage that we leave on the landscape. They reduce the spread of disease such as rabies. The best example is, of course, from the subcontinent of India that I'm going to talk about. A pretty neat paper that's somewhat contemporary, I guess 5 years old now. We haven't done this for black vultures yet, but turkey vultures remove approximately 1,000 tons or $700 million of US dollars worth of organic waste material per year. So those are the kinds of ecosystem services. I'm guessing that black vultures, if you looked at it globally, the number would actually be higher than that, but it's something that I haven't gotten to. Hopefully others will be able to quantify that. And again, the vulture crises in Asia and Africa are pretty astounding, and I don't mean that in a favorable manner. There's been folks that have talked about the subcontinent of India and the diclofenac. This veterinary drug basically causes acute kidney failure for these vultures, and death occurs within just a couple days. The crisis in Africa is quite interesting. There's several factors, including veterinary drugs, that can be contributing to that. Unfortunately, poachers in some areas have figured out that if you remove the vultures from the sky, then the folks that are tasked with trying to find the poachers are less likely to be able to cue in on the ungulates and other animals that they've killed. So that's an issue where they're finding really massive amounts of vultures poisoned by poachers. Has anybody ever heard of a lucky rabbit's foot? That maybe some of the older folks in the room. Okay, I know I had one as a kid. I had one as a kid. So in some areas in Africa, certain species of vultures, there's believed to have superstitious and good luck value for the vulture parts, to the extent that the heads of vultures have been recovered under people's pillows during inspections. They believe that they cause good luck, so there's also probably some vulture take occurring for those reasons as well. So I don't think we can take it likely and for granted the conditions we have with black and turkey vultures here. This is a paper that just came out this year, and I think it's the best so far of quantifying the subcontinent of India vulture collapse. And this is where they were actually really to be able to put some numbers on this. So what they were able to do is they looked at human death rates across India in areas where the vulture declines were precipitous and where they weren't, and they actually found changes in the human death rates in areas where the losses were largest. And I was actually surprised by some of these numbers. So they took a really economic standpoint on this paper, and they quantified it by the loss of those lives and the economic input that they would have been providing to the economy and those local economies, that the damage is $70 billion per year, so not million. And again, this is just showing you a graph of how those indirect effects can occur. We lose most of the vultures from a landscape, more livestock and carrion, equates to more dogs and rats, which equates to more people getting rabies, but also more water pollution. This is one that I wasn't aware of until I read this paper, was the fecal coliform issue, and that they found that people were getting sick from fecal coliform more in these areas. Of course, causality could not be established because this is an observational study, but I thought it was quite convincing. So I'm going to lead us back a little bit more to our focal species. We have a pretty good idea of how many black vultures are out there. Some folks a lot smarter than I came up with global population estimates for almost 10,000 birds a few years ago, and they estimated the black vultures at about 74 million. So, a lot of vultures compared to some of the other species. We also have kind of state-by-state population estimates by some other folks, and they also divided this up by some of the bird conservation regions and also the migratory flyways. But if you can see on the right, I know it's kind of small. Yeah, is it your right? Yeah. Florida would boast the largest number of black vultures in the United States, and then we have states in kind of the upper Midwest where that number is smaller. But I would wager that in some of these states, such as Missouri and in Ohio, some of these numbers might be higher now than the 2019 estimate. As most of you know, the folks that run the Breeding Bird Survey, you can go to that website and you can get pretty neat outputs on relative population growth per year. Again, it doesn't account for detection probability and things of that nature, but over the last few decades, the annual increase for black vultures is still holding at about 3.2%, I believe. They don't have the last couple years of data up. I think they're always kind of trying to play catch up with all the data that they have, so it will be interesting to see if some of the high path avian influenza stuff is going to affect the populations, because it did affect black vultures, which is, I think, a lot of people were surprised by, because they're usually pretty robust when it comes to disease. This is just showing the raw eBird data with black vulture range expansion. There are certainly some anomalous, incorrect little dots in here. We don't have black vultures on the West Coast or any of those, but this is the raw data, so I wanted to show it. So pink is what I would kind of consider the historical range of black vultures, if you will, and then the purple would be more in the last 20-ish years. This is just showing you that we quantifying it, showing you a graph rather than a picture. This is by a recent master's thesis that I was involved in. But as you can see, leveraging both the Christmas bird count data and the Breeding Bird Survey data, which are our best longitudinal sources of data for migratory birds, you can see this latitudinal increase is taking place, and it's taking place fairly steadily. Obviously, the credible interval with the Breeding Bird Survey there is a lot larger for various reasons, but we certainly know that it's happening. This is just showing you that folks are noticing the black vulture range expansion, and some of these articles were pretty neat to read. The first black vulture nest that was found in Burlington, Vermont, I think it was a pretty neat story. It was an abandoned building right in town, and the town kind of like took that on, and it kind of were really proud of their local black vulture nest, and that vulture nest ended up fledging. So that was a pretty neat story. Some of the news stories that have come out on black vultures aren't necessarily as rosy as I'm going to show in another slide. But again, folks are noticing this, and there's a mixed bag of perception on that. So why do we think they're increasing? We certainly think climate change is a contributing factor. I haven't been able to quantify yet, but I think there's a real sweet spot of both a combination of cold and wet days that these guys just really don't like. And if you have less of those in those northern latitude areas, it's allowing them to be able to make a living better up there. But we're still trying to quantify that officially. And of course, we provided vultures with tons of predictable and easily accessible food sources. As I said, 50% of pellets that we did in a review study had anthropogenic items in them. And certainly, as most of you guys know, with the soaring raptors, we've created a lot of uplift and soaring opportunities for these guys. I mean, the concrete in Florida gets really, really hot, and I see these guys soaring above all that all the time. So, and we've also created a lot of roost opportunities for these guys, right? Some of them are more indicative of what we might see in the landscape in the United States as in communication towers, but we even have more interesting cultural places in Central and South America where black vultures like to make a living now. So as was alluded, with an increase, within a species that's doing quite well, you can have human-wildlife conflict at times, and we certainly do have some of that with the black vultures. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, but these are just some photos showing you that this might be going on. Black vultures tend to be on the more aggressive side for vulture species that I've encountered, and there is some instances where in the scientific literature, it's actually been shown that they occasionally will kill live animals since the late 1950s. It's usually smaller critters, and they're certainly primarily scavengers, but we have it in the literature that they do take live prey on occasion. And there is some evidence that they will occasionally take a very newborn livestock, and so that's one of the things that we're working on. But as you can imagine, it can be a very tricky and difficult thing to both prove and disprove because they are very good at eating the evidence. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. So there's a lot of ways that you can divide up or parse human-wildlife conflict, but this is the categories that the agency that I work for tends to use. You can certainly look at it differently, but health and human safety is one category that we have, and I think bird airstrike collisions are probably a good example of that. You certainly could throw some zoonotic disease stuff in here as well. Property damage, there are examples of this. We get calls from communication tower managers occasionally explaining to us why having hundreds of black vultures on their communication towers can be an issue. Black vultures also have a high propensity for pecking and dismantling vinyl and rubber substances. It's pretty fascinating behavior, and they're not the only species that does this. I was reminded at a talk a couple of weeks ago that the Kias in New Zealand will also do this, so I'm hoping to reach out to some of those folks and see if they have got it figured out. We still don't know why they do that. If some of you guys have some theories, I would love to know it. Some people state olfaction, but black vultures don't have the greatest sense of smell for a vulture species. Not nearly the olfactory bulb as a turkey vulture. So, natural resources protection. Usually, when I talk about natural resources protection, I use the example of sea turtle nest and egg protection from like wild pigs, because that's an issue that we really deal with in Florida. However, I came across this article just within the last couple months where and several beaches in Costa Rica, they're actually having challenges now with jaguars taking adult sea turtles, so adult leatherbacks. And if you're the net resource manager trying to boost sea turtle production or maintain it, that can potentially be a natural resources protection conflict. Doesn't necessarily, of course, have to be, but I thought that was pretty fascinating, and I'd never heard of jaguars taking adult sea turtles. So I think you can make the argument that for the categories that we tend to use, the black vultures can at times have conflict with 3 out of the 4. And so this is getting at some more news articles that have gone into the increase in human vulture conflicts. I get calls from the media about quarterly to talk about black vultures, and I try to encourage temperance on this topic. And as you can see, that's not always met. And some of these, there's actually one or two that are so vitriolic I didn't even feel comfortable putting them on here. But as you can see, some of these, I get it, I guess. People need to try to get clicks on their news articles, but some of this is blown out of proportion. And so, but I think it is important to show, because these kind of articles are coming out, and one just came out last month. Just to put a little bit more perspective that the conflict is increasing with the increased population. So these are work tasks for our agency's operational folks. We have about 5,000 people throughout the country that work on human-wildlife conflict as far as boots on the ground. So this is any time that the operational folks get a call about black vultures. We might not necessarily take any action. A lot of the times it might just be doing a site visit for the landowner and providing technical advice on what they potentially can and cannot do, because this is, of course, a protected species under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. But as you can see, the work tasks have been increasing steadily throughout the 2000s. However, in these last few years, you can see it's kind of steadying out, and it'd be interesting to see if that trend continues. This is a little bit more specific. This is just talking about wildlife strikes involving black vultures. This is a publicly available database, the wildlife strike database, that you guys can just Google at this, and you can look this up for almost any species of where there are bird strikes. But as you can see, these are civilian aircraft, and so the bird strikes are increasing. In the last 5 years, the Navy has actually lost 2 of their fighter jet planes to black vultures, to where the planes were completely destroyed, but luckily the pilots survived. And each one of those planes is about $40 million. So now the Navy is so concerned that they're actually funding some research on the sensory ecology of black vultures to try to figure out if there can be any modifications done to these fighter jets to allow those black vultures a little bit more time to react and try to get out of the way. And so that's stuff that's being done at Purdue University right now. This is just looking at the conflict by another type of way. This is dividing up the different types of damage into a little bit further categories, but keeping in mind of those 3 main subcategories that I discussed earlier. As you can see, actually vehicles and equipment comes up as number 1. Again, it's that propensity for these guys to peck at the vinyl and rubber materials. But if you were to add up all of the different livestock subcategories there, it would probably be a close second or third to those top ones. I want to talk a little bit more about the conflict as far as we tried to actually predict conflict using existing data sources. So we looked at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service black vulture depredation permits, and the Fish and Wildlife Service is a great partner in helping us with those data. And then we also looked at our internal wildlife services work tasks, of which I already showed. And this is a University of Georgia thesis. And so we wanted to look at the predicted conflict between 2 different timestamps, basically 2009 and 2019. We picked that because there was marked increase in the population and the spatial expansion during that time. And then, of course, we examined the effects of spatial covariates. I'm not talking much about models and statistics in this talk, but we did do an additive modeling framework within a Bayesian framework. We decided not to take an ensemble approach here. So this is the predicted conflict for the year 2009, again, using all of the existing data that we have. The darker red represents the higher probability for conflict, and this is across all 3 of those category types. So as you can see, we do have some pretty red areas, but for the most part, you also have quite a few areas with low probability of conflict. If we look at 2019, as you can see, the probability of conflict not only did a little bit of a northern shift, but also there's a lot more red in some of the states where we've historically had black vultures for a long time, including Texas and Florida. Some of the covariates that we examined, I was kind of surprised that some of these came out on top, considering that we looked at all the conflict combined. But the cattle density, which the USDA does a pretty good job of tracking at the county level, I believe, did show a positive response with that conflict. Another one that we weren't surprised at, because these guys tend to do pretty good in heterogeneic environments, was the proportion of developed open land cover. But you certainly can get into areas where it's too developed for these guys. This is just showing more of the covariates that we looked at. Nothing super earth-shattering here. A few of the ones that we thought might have a stronger explanatory power, such as cell tower densities, really didn't, at least at the spatial scale that we looked at. Electrical line densities, a little bit. So what do we talk about when we try to sell this thesis? We believe this approach can be used to better understand both this and other conflicts, and we feel that this could be an opportunity for folks to be more proactive. For example, a wildlife manager could potentially look at that map, and if they've got really red areas in their specific geographical area, it might be an opportunity to hit up some vulture outreach activities and kind of let people know how important vultures are in case they're potentially going to see some of those conflicts as well. We also think that this approach could potentially be flipped on the other side and be used to map persecution areas for some of the vulture species that aren't doing so well. And we've been talking to some folks in Africa and some of those persecution areas to try to get some of that jump started. I'm going to change gears and talk about vulture management tools now. These are a few of the many tools that can be brought to bear with black vultures. I'm not going to talk about each one specifically, but the effigy is fairly fascinating. This works for some avian species, and it seems to anecdotally even work better if the effigy is represented by an animal that they actually know. So this is usually a taxidermy or actually a carcass of a vulture that is hung up in a roost area, and it can facilitate roost abandonment in an area. Habitat management, this is not practical in all situations, but for smaller livestock production areas, black vultures tend to like trees without a lot of foliage, not always, but sometimes. So we do sometimes actually recommend habitat management, perhaps maybe get rid of that big tree that they're roosting in if you think that the vultures are an issue in your particular area. Trapping and a few other things. There is some lethal removal of black vultures. It's never done, it's always authorized, and it's part of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act permitting process. And it has to be done only if non-lethal has proved to be non-effective, and it has to be done in accordance with non-lethal measures. And so it's not used as a tool to reduce the population. It's used as a potential ability to reinforce those stimuli that you are using for the non-lethal tools. So when it boils down to wildlife damage management and human-wildlife conflict, a kind of a golden rule is that it's really site-specific, and an integrated approach is best. You might be able to use 3 tools at one site, but at the very next area, you might not be able to use firecrackers and bird bangers because you're going to be getting calls from a homeowners association. So it's just it just spans the whole board. The efficacy of many of these tools remains unquantified. That's one of the things that colleagues and I are trying to tackle. And it's been made pretty clear to me that that folks also want more non-lethal tools in the tool shed, if you will. So to that end, I'm going to talk very briefly again about a paper that we came out with, I think, last year, where we tested an inflatable deterrent for trying to reduce black vulture damage at some of these areas where they, as you're going to see shortly, like to really have their way with the rubber and vinyl products. So this is a parking lot in Everglades National Park. They actually give out tarps in this parking lot and encourage people to use them to try to reduce the black vulture damage. These black vultures are not dummies. They've actually learned to pull some of those tarps off in certain situations. And so this is you're going to see that it's not just one group. This is basically taking place in the entire parking lot. And we weren't sure if there was, this is collecting baseline data for our inflatable deterrent work. So the Jeep Cherokee that we just zoomed in right there, that's actually, you'll notice it has a USDA license plate. That was our sacrificial lamb, if you will, my 2000 Jeep Cherokee, because we didn't know there was going to be other vehicles in the parking lot. And we did actually have to replace the windshield gasket on that vehicle. So Not all the damage areas are this pervasive. This is a parking lot where this damage has been occurring for over 25 years, so very much a learned behavior probably with this social group. But again, as you saw from some of those slides I showed, this is happening at least sporadically where vultures occur. So why the heck did we test an inflatable deterrent, you're probably asking, that looks like a big red snake? Others have found that this inflatable deterrent has been effective with passerine species, and some of that was published somewhat recently. Over the first 2 years of my time in this job, I also got calls from a couple homeowners, including a couple in Costa Rica, saying that they actually had some luck with the inflatable deterrents keeping the vultures off of their roof. And so we thought, we might as well give it a shot and test it, since people say they want more tools. So again, just showing you what it looks like. I should have had a video of it flooring the wind, but you've all seen this, the car dealership wavy guys. This is just a different, smaller version that's apparently intended to look scary. I would love to know what a vulture thinks when it sees this giant red snake, but I fortunately can't worm into their brain. So these black dots on the right are showing the study site locations. We were lucky enough to get 13 sites kind of throughout the southeastern United States over a 2-year period. And most of these were recreation sites, some spring sites. There was also a teaching zoo, and there was a couple school kind of athletic areas with like rubber running tracks, and also some dams. So when we first took a look at the data, we showed that during the treatment phase, we did reduce the number of black vultures at those sites. However, as you can see, post-treatment, within a few weeks of reducing those tools, most of the vultures seem to be coming back. We did want to take a look at this a little bit closer. So we parsed the data by the actual site-specific tolerance of vultures to humans using flight initiation distance, which has been used in the literature for a long time. And we found slightly maybe encouraging news when we looked at it that way. If you look at the sites where the conflict has not been long-standing and the human tolerance there for the vultures is low, so that would be the left-hand sides, during that post-treatment area, and this includes several months after we removed it, it seemed that the vultures had still had a fear of those sites and they had not come back yet. So this inflatable deterrent has been adopted at least one of those sites that we practiced, and it's being used by at least some folks in our Arkansas program. I don't think it's going to take over, and obviously this is a tool that we would not recommend on a 5,000-acre cattle ranch, right? This is for small spatial footprint areas, parking lots, things of that nature. And in reality, we wouldn't recommend it that it's used independently because of that integrated approach being best, but we decided to test it independently from a statistical standpoint and from an inference standpoint. So kind of already repeated all this, but yeah, we feel like that this is something that can be used under very specific, unique situations if the folks that are in charge of those areas feel like they need to have less black vultures in the area. So I'm going to change gears again to the black vulture livestock conflict, because if you remember those media reports, this is the thing that gets often the most attention. I think we've done an okay job in this country of calculating and coming up with the observed and reported losses of vultures to livestock, and this is some of this information here. But I want to also underscore and emphasize that these are reports and that these things have not been verified. The only one of these that I've been involved with was the Wall et al. 2022, and that was a livestock producer survey in the Indiana-Kentucky area that I'll talk about a little bit more shortly. So we have been trying to better understand this conflict some. This is a paper where we took a very similar approach to mapping the conflict with that University of Georgia thesis, but this is only focusing on a 6-state area and only focusing on conflict data that is involving livestock. So this is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Wildlife Services conflict information. And we also tried to look at the covariates there on the right that should be explaining where this conflict is likely to or potentially to occur in the future. So the map is basically, again, a heat map. It's showing you at a zip code spatial extent, because that's the closest we could do because of PII concerns, where there's a higher likelihood of probability of livestock conflict. And as you would imagine, some of the covariates were not earth-shattering, proportion of agriculture and cattle density were high. Some of the ones that we thought might be contributing factors, such as distance to open water or distance to landfill or open water, those were not so much. But primarily agriculture and, of course, black vulture habitat. You're more likely to have this conflict where the black vultures are comfortable making a living, and this is a species that does a really good in a mixed substrate. So this is another paper that's a couple of years old, and again, this is that livestock producer paper that I mentioned. So this is where we asked the livestock producers to tell us what they think about black vultures. And again, you gotta remember, this is one of the range expansion areas. So this is areas where farmers and ranchers haven't historically been coexisting with black vultures. And so we thought it would be interesting to kind of survey some of them in a new area, if you were. Those are the reported losses by livestock type over there on the left, but overall it was about 36% of livestock producers reported an incident or incidents of black vultures depredating on newborn livestock. We also wanted to ask the livestock producers what tools, if any, that they found were potentially effective at reducing this conflict. As you can see, some of them, carcass disposal was something that it sounds like people are doing, and that's extremely important. So that was encouraging. One of the things that I also found interesting is that guard animals, over 50% of the producers surveyed felt that guard animals were actually effective for black vultures, which I was surprised by. The problem is, with any social science survey, you have to be careful of the number of questions that you ask, or basically you get survey fatigue. And so I didn't actually parse into what types of guard animals, and so that's something that we're hoping to look into in the future. Oh, guard animals. Oops, sorry, forgot about the animation. This is another work that we did, again, in this southern Indiana area. We really wanted to look at some of the scavenging behavior of black vultures, and turkey vultures usually come along for the ride as well, especially because we know that sometimes when livestock producers find these cattle with their eyes gone and a couple other things, it can be a very emotional response, and they might be pretty likely to, or to assume that there might be an avian predator responsible, such as a vulture. However, if any of you guys grew up in ranching or farming community, there's also a lot of newborn cattle that don't make it for other various reasons, and stillborns certainly happen. So we wanted to kind of look at the scavenging behavior of the species and see what we could determine, and that's what the taphonomic signatures basically means, is looking at the patterns of eating post-mortem. So we took stillborn dairy cattle and placed them out in an agricultural research center. We did find a couple differences between black vultures and turkey vultures. The turkey vultures seem to have a greater like for eyes than black vultures, but in the end, they eventually would kind of go for the same areas. But really what we thought was a driving factor that we wanted to take home for this paper was that we felt like that it demonstrates that the criteria at times that are used to identify livestock depredation, right? Missing eyes, missing tongue, perineum areas being eaten, that is not a sign of depredation, right? That is a sign of scavenging. And so we're trying to advance the needle a little bit on this topic. And really, I don't think that myself and others have done a great job on the reported versus actual for black vultures. So these are some works from other vulture species or black vultures in South America that I really think that we need to lean on and find ways to maybe somewhat replicate. So for griffon vultures in France, 24%, only 24% of the veterinarian assessments of these are cattle that were brought to them where folks thought vultures might have had a role in the demise of the animal. Only 24% of them had evidence that that the vultures were pecking at those animals before they were dead. That's actually not 24% that they believe that the vultures were responsible. It was just signs of like slight hemorrhaging, if you will. For griffon vultures in Spain, 22% of the claims of livestock loss, and this is predominantly sheep, were verified as vulture predation by, again, these are veterinarians that are doing these assessments. And so, but again, so 1 out of 5 of the claimed livestock losses was an actual vulture attack, according to these veterinarian assessments. And then this a pretty good study in Argentina here. This is much more observational in nature. This didn't involve veterinarians, but of 42 lamb births where they were able to have kind of folks with spotting scopes on, 12% resulted in the death of lamb, and black vultures were predominantly responsible for those. There was a couple of times where it was a mixed flock. One time there was an Andean condor involved, and I believe some caracaras. And so that's published and in the literature. But again, only 12% of all the observations, and that's when you have vultures right next to a newborn lamb. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done with this amazing species. One of the things that, again, I'm trying to get at is the reported versus verified, because I really think that that's what we need for this country and some in other areas. My job is to evaluate the efficacy of vulture management tools, so obviously I think that's important. I didn't talk about any of our movement studies, but we have approximately 40 transmitters out on black vultures right now in various areas, and so we're constantly doing step selection functions, resource selections, trying to gain a better understanding. One thing that we do know about these black vultures is that the home ranges and the resource selection can be quite different in different areas. So we really caution against an inference from a study, say in southern Indiana, to extrapolate those findings in Texas or Florida. But as a lot of you know, that happens pretty often with these telemetry studies. People really love to put wing tags on vultures, but there really isn't a whole lot of published information on what that can bring to bear, except for, observations of, distances traveled and things of that nature. So one of the things I'm hoping people want to look at is the utility, and can we do more information with that opportunistic resighting information for the wing tags. So, and yeah, that's all I had. I appreciate your time. Okay. Yes, sir.
Bryan, and I mean, you touched on this subject, and we're going to be talking about it a lot tomorrow, but in Georgia, black vultures in particular really got hammered by avian influenza, much more so than what we saw in turkey vultures. And at a time where we're talking about their population numbers increasing, and we're seeing, as in many other southeastern states, a demand by the ranching community for greater latitude for vulture depredation. Are we taking that into account, just how perhaps vulture populations were set back by avian influenza?
Yeah. So the best, without throwing the kitchen sink and a bunch of resources at a specific study for that, the best approach is to leverage things like the breeding bird survey data. And so we have plans on trying to look at some of those areas. We have a pretty good idea of where some of the black vulture die-offs were occurring. We don't have as good of idea on die-offs that we might have missed, but there are going to be opportunities to potentially redo things like allowable take models and the population estimates. But as far as I know, those population numbers have not been adjusted yet. So.
Make one observation about that. You mentioned that earlier too, the breeding bird survey. I'm sure you realize that survey doesn't do a very good job of assessing vulture numbers.
Yeah, so the way that folks have tried to leverage that data is they did a detection probability study using transmitters in Virginia. So basically, during the breeding bird survey routes, they were able to, with telemetry data, figure out the number of vultures that were actually flying and countable and the ones that weren't at that time. So that's how they adjusted the breeding bird survey data to get at a population estimate. Now, it's not perfect because they extrapolated that Virginia study across all of the black vulture range and the breeding bird survey routes, but that's how I agree that it is just an index without that information, and that was done in Virginia in the early 2000s. So you could make an argument that it should be done in new areas. So, yes.
Attacking situation. Have you tried electric shock? The American Fund used that for condors.
Really?
Like low level.
Okay.
To train them to not feed their young
Really? Okay. We have not tried that, and I wasn't aware of that work, but I'll definitely. Yeah, absolutely.
Like closing down a parking lot, having a few cars that are rigged that you tested that aren't
Yeah.
very lethal levels, but I mean, when a bird gets electrocuted, electric shock.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's not. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyways, I would say talk to the folks in areas like
Okay.
that.
That sounds good. Did you have a question, sir?
Yeah, I was wondering about predator compensation. So from in Alberta, where some species, so if a rancher loses an animal to a grizzly bear or a wolf, they're compensated,
Mhm.
but other species are not. So I'm just wondering how you can sort of skew
Yeah.
reporting and so on.
There is a livestock indemnity program, and there are folks that have gotten some the compensation for verified black vulture losses. Those livestock indemnity programs are run by the FSA, Farm Service Agency, and it seems like it's highly variable by state to state by both how they work with livestock producers and their verification process. I have a colleague that works in Kentucky, and he's had some FSA agents text him literally like pictures of vulture feathers next to a dead animal and people trying to get compensation for that. And so, the long answer short, there is an indemnity program, but I think at the agency level, myself and other agencies, we need to do a better job of trying to standardize that process and making it as fair and scientifically robust as possible. So, but it seems to be very highly variable by state, and some of the states don't even answer my calls. So, yeah. Yes, sir.
Is anyone working on the basic demography of this bird? Age structure, birth rates, death rates, survival, et cetera, et cetera?
My predecessor tried to look at age structure by trying to use biomarkers to get at chronological age for these guys. A similar effort was successful with double-crested cormorants, but has not been successful with some gull species. So chronicling their exact age is difficult given this current science that we have, but there are potential opportunities because there's new biomarkers, and now they do these co-analyses. The population models for these guys currently in the allowable take models don't use annual survival estimates for black vultures. They use griffin vulture as a surrogate. So one of the papers that we're working on right now is calculating annual survival, and so far the annual survival looks to be about 91%. And of course, coincidental or however you want to look at it, it's actually very similar to adult griffin vulture survival. So yeah, we are trying to increase those demographic parameters, and we actually don't even have a great idea on age at first breeding for these guys because it's hard to get at that age. So for some species, like cormorants, you get a lot of tags out in the colonies when the birds are young, but the number of known age vultures is pretty rare. I have a list from zoos that I eventually want to reach out to do that biomarker work. So, yes.
Obviously, there's some areas in Americas where turkey vultures and black vultures have been coexisting for a long time.
Yeah.
Is there any concern in North America that there might be displacement as their range increases?
We haven't quantified it specifically as far as like having putting numerous transmitters for both species in certain areas. We have looked at competition at the carcass sites between black vultures and turkey vultures at some of these range expansion areas. So another side project from the 30 stillborn dairy cattle that we put out is we just examined the competition. And what we really found is even though the turkey vultures usually have to wait in line a little bit, that usually everybody gets their chance at the table. And so I don't think that there's a whole lot of displacement. In fact, what we found is the black vultures actually show more aggression towards each other than they do to turkey vultures. But that can make sense, right? Because they're much more social and they have more of a hierarchy than the turkey vultures. And they undoubtedly know the difference between a sibling and a black vulture that's not related, I believe. So, yeah. But thanks. That's a good question. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Just to follow up with that too, one of the notions that I've been aware of is the fact that it's not
Yeah. 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 Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and that it's been verified with telemetry data, right? So yeah, that's pretty neat. And so yeah, I mean, just anecdotally, yeah, there's vultures in the sky basically at all times in Florida, and usually you see the black vultures be about 100 or 200 meters above the turkey vultures, because I believe the turkey vulture has been identified as potentially the best smelling vulture with their big olfactory bulb, and I think black vultures are somewhere closer to like a red-tailed hawk, at least in bulb size, I think. Yeah, but I think the way that we trap these guys, I think even the black vultures can smell our traps coming, because especially when we are at a fish hatchery and we're using like 5-gallon buckets of dead trout to lure them in. You want to wear your rubber boots on those days. So, yes, sir.
Have you looked at raptor gill effects? Certainly ground predators can be less effective than raptors, and I wondered how black vultures would respond, for instance, to silhouettes, kites, with people outlines.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we think is certainly worth looking at, especially since the effigy has some effectiveness. I think that they certainly seem to have the ability to kind of recognize those things, but that's something that we haven't specifically looked at. It's kind of tangential, but there have been folks that have done pretty good studies where they've excluded the avian scavengers to see if the faculative scavengers like raccoons and others kind of do the same role of ridding the landscape from that carrion and potentially getting that bacteria off that landscape. And most of the studies have shown that the mammalian scavengers, they can't do the same role as these vultures. They're just not as efficient, and those carcasses end up being on the landscape longer. But I think your silhouette idea is an excellent one, and we'll certainly try to look into that. Yes.
I can see how black vultures, why they're not in places like Oregon and Washington and those really wet, cold areas year round, but I don't understand why they haven't been able to spread into more of the Southwest and California coast, especially around really populated areas.
Yeah.
Such potentials.
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't looked at it from a whole. I'll have to admit that a lot of our space use stuff has been more at the second and third orders of habitat selection rather than that first order or distribution. That is something that's on our list to do. But you're right. I mean, the areas that I see vultures now in central Missouri, which is where one of our tracking studies is, I can drive through areas of Iowa and Nebraska, and they look pretty similar. And yeah, the Southwest is interesting too, because you're right. There's a very robust population in Texas, and so I can't answer that definitively, but it's kind of like on the to-do list. If you have some ideas, I'd love to hear them. So.
Thank you very much, Bryan. Thanks for all.